Hello, everyone, and welcome to the video art lecture for the Intro to Electronic Arts class, fall 2020, um, with repeated dumpster fires provided at no charge. So, welcome all to our lecture in video art during the apocalypse. So, without starting on too glib of a note, today we're going to talk about video art and how it kind of mutated from film, and talk about like analog and digital video, and then go over some video artists that were active in the early days, and then some that have continued making work up until the present. First piece, and again, please check out the accompanying YouTube playlist for additional videos. Like this piece that we're looking at now is a perfect example of that. So take the time to watch the accompanying YouTube videos. Go ahead and pause this one and then go and find the one that we're talking about to watch it. So, at least with a couple of them, so that you have an idea of how everything that I'm saying gets actually applied by these artists into pieces. First off, we're going to talk about the Paradise Institute, which was a piece in 2001 done by Janet Cardiff and George Burrs Miller. You all may remember Janet Cardiff from the sound art lecture. So in 2001, she made a piece with George Burrs Miller called the Paradise Institute, and it was a kind of combined. Well, I guess, sound is sort of inherently part of video, or it has been for a long time. We're way out of the silent movie area, yeah. So this was a piece where you stepped into a little box, and it was a kind of constructed a box in a gallery, and you sat down on actual chairs, and as you looked forward, there was sort of a false perspective theater built out in front of you around a television screen, and so it looked like you were in a movie theater. And then you put on headphones and then experience the sort of the picture, this sort of weird film about that has a hard to follow narrative, sort of blends in with your auditory experience sitting within this fake theater. I would say find the piece on the YouTube playlist, and I would say turn off the lights and put on some headphones, and it's just a snippet of it, so it's only about 8 minutes, but it should give you a really good idea of what some of the really kind of amazing things that happen. And I don't want to talk about it too much to spoil it, but this is actually one piece I think that you can kind of somewhat replicate at home without having to necessarily see it in the gallery, at least compared to some of the other pieces. So check it out. But it's a real good example of a video piece that doesn't just live on a TV, or doesn't just live in a projection. It actually has this kind of three-dimensional element, surrounding element to it, and then also this really kind of important audio element, that it's not just audio for whatever the video is. It's the audio kind of provides its own background and its own contribution to the overall piece. So check it out. So let's talk about digital versus analog. So analog was the first kind of technology that came out, and so with analog signals, you have sort of, whether it's a electrical wave or something, you have something that represents something else in sort of a more fluid fashion, right? So there's, I'm trying to think, like analog technology would be films, right? You kind of what's happening in real life, and especially on old films, right, where you actually had film that was sort of represented by these changing pictures, right? These changing individual shots. With sound, again, like, analog sound technology would be like records and cassette tapes, which we'll talk about in a second, and videotapes. where, I mean, with records, there's an actual, if all of you have access to a record player, or if you do, try putting on a record without actually turning on the stereo so that there's no sound, but you can still, like, the record's still moving. And if you put your ear up to the needle, you'll actually hear the sound. And that's because the grooves in the record are actual representation of the sound waves that you would hear. And then with later recordings, so that's kind of analog, right? So there's these grooves in the record that will produce actual acoustic sound. And then with tape and some of the other things we'll talk about, that gets replaced by by sort of magnetic fields recorded onto metal tape. So then we'll talk about digital, right? So digital is taking all this kind of information that's, you can see in the analog chart here, the flowy line, and then actually processing it and converting it into binary, so ones and zeros, and turning it into a digital signal, and then kind of continuing to process it at that point. So there's a conversion that happens, right? There's this digital representation of something that was once acoustic or analog, but it's, a lot of people say there's like a shift and there's something that happens as far as audio quality, those types of things, which I'm not always sure is 100% accurate, but it's also something interesting to think about, right? There's an actual translation, so you're getting a sort of a facsimile of the initial thing as opposed to a, kind of a very representational recording with analog. So, really early film is sort of like the first, I guess, of the start of video art, right? Yeah, you couldn't have video art without film. And so, as we kind of talked about a little bit early on, film was this process of taking photographic images and putting them one after another so that we could see movement, or our brains would see movement, our eyes would see movement, even if there was no actual movement, even if we were just looking at a bunch of pictures one after another, right? So really early, like, projection and recording technologies all sort of, as far as video goes, really focused around this idea of film. And here's a representation of how even like a little Super 8 or sort of real, 16 millimeter film projector works. And again, just sort of, projecting film is actually the first kind of way that people saw it in movie theaters, in our homes eventually. And so, film was pretty widely available, but at the same time it was really expensive, right? Because you had to actually buy film, and then you had to process it, and then you had to get it back. Editing it could be somewhat difficult, right? Because you actually had to make cuts in the film and tape different segments together. So there was a kind of a lot that went into doing film work, and then a lot of that changed when video was introduced, right? So with video, sorry, 1 second, let me just adjust my notes. So yes, then you have video, right? And how is video different from analog film? Well, video is sort of this, in one sense, right? So film, you've got these kind of moving pictures, and they show one after another, right? You've got a total image, one after. So, as you can see on the TV screen here, and we'll talk about this with Joan Jonas's work, Vertical Roll, how you would refresh video images is one line at a time from the top to the bottom. So, really quickly, it's constantly refreshing things like on a rolling basis from the top to the bottom of the lights in the screen. And that's how we would trick our brains into seeing motion and movement. So there's like that aspect of just the video, and projection screens as opposed to television screens versus projection. And then as far as video goes, it's instead of capturing it on film, you're capturing it into, or actually like kind of translating the visual images into electromagnetic, magnetic magnetic fields. That's right, magnetic fields on an actual tape. And so kind of what this does is it opens up the possibility of being able to re-record stuff, just sort of overdub stuff on tape. You can play it back multiple times really easy. You can make edits to it fairly easier. But also, the quality of the image and what information is captured is different from just film. So here's an example of how magnetic tape works. So you have a tape head, and you've got sort of a current signal, which is sort of the representation of either image or what we were talking about with sound or image or both, that gets translated into an electronic pulse, which then activates this tape head, which converts that electronic pulse into a magnetic pulse, and then that magnetic pulse rearranges sort of the magnetic emulsion on the tape in order to record that information. And a big advantage of these types of systems is you could also re-record on one tape multiple times, until actually the tape became stretched out and broke. As opposed to film, where every time you capture something on film, you'd have to get it. Excuse me. And if you didn't process it yourself, you'd have to send it off and wait for it to come back and then see what you got, right? So this is, the sort of creative feedback loop is much smaller with magnetic tape, because you can record something, you can watch it right away, and then if you don't like it, you can change it, or you can delete it, or you can re-record it all within a relatively short amount of time. So here's a couple images of VHS tape, which I grew up with, and I'm sure some of you did too. And then a cassette tape, which is actually making kind of a resurgence as far as I've been able to tell in recording music. But I remember during this time too, they came out with low resolution video recorders that would take cassette tapes and all kinds of crazy stuff. So we'll go through a really quick tour of video recording technologies. So this is the Ampex Quadruplex VR1000B analog tape recorder, and you can see the reels of tape on top, and that big bar on top is sort of where the tape heads are held. And it was the first commercially successful videotape recorder, and for $50,000, only television stations could afford them. So again, like, access to it was fairly limited, but it's sort of the first introduction of tape for video into commercial markets. Next, the Sony CV2000 in 1965. And this is one of the first home tape recorders. And you used to have to pay $40 per reel of tape, and this is in 1965 dollars. You can imagine what it is now. And so it was used a lot by businesses, but it sort of missed the home market, where we were supposed to record sort of things in our day-to-day life at home. The first portable videotape recorder was the Ampex Quadruplex VR1000. So, I mean, think about the idea of actually being able to take video, and I mean, now something which we take for granted, right? Like this idea of being able to record video anywhere and having it be sort of a mobile capturing, platform, which was actually really present with film cameras, right? You could take a 16 millimeter camera anywhere and record images with it, but you'd have to get it processed, right? So I think there's a push towards getting that as far as video goes, which really became successful with the Sony Portapak. So it was a lower quality video than TV, but it really attracted the home market. And this is, and it was also really affordable. So it was only about $3,000. So you could get groups that weren't TV stations or weren't huge sort of organizations to be able to, arts organizations could afford to buy one of these and rent it out or loan it out to artists to capture things, right? And this is also sort of where you get a resurgence in people using video to capture events from a people's perspective as opposed to sort of a media perspective. So this comes into play with like the civil rights movement, with LGBTQIA rights, a lot of sort of the counterculture stuff that was happening in the 60s. All of a sudden you have a affordable means of media production that somebody can use to tell a side of the story that maybe wasn't told, right? Because of discrimination, because of race or, gender or sex or any of these things. Pretty big watershed moment as far as being able to tell, different sides to the same story. And then also being able to sort of record and edit and things also within a real quick time frame and within a studio or without much equipment was super important as far as that goes too. So we had the Portapaks, and then we kind of get into the home camcorder market where you didn't have to carry around a backpack. It was all sort of hunched on your shoulder. So they started off really big, and then they get smaller. and then the RCA camcorder, which my father had, and I think we've got some videos recorded on that somewhere. And then, so these were all analog devices. So you'd actually put an analog tape in there, and it would record things. It would take sort of the images it was recording in sound and translate them into magnetic pulses, and then that would be recorded onto an actual physical tape. And then in the 90s, digital cameras started to come along. And so this was the first tapeless video recording system. It was 128 gigabyte flash memory, so 9 hours of video, and it only sold 50 units because it was power hungry and fairly heavy. So like a lot of things, the first kind of foray into making some of this technology available to consumers, that it was kind of clunky. And so digital cameras work because it has this little digital image sensor in it, and it basically a film camera works by taking in an image through a lens and projecting it onto a piece of film, which is sensitive to light, and then exposing that piece of film for an instant to that light, and then capturing that image, and then moving on to the next one. So this is very similar to that process where this little square in the middle gets exposed to light, and then those sort of representations of light in, sound too, get translated into binary ones and zeros, and then get stored onto, some kind of storage device. Now, everything in our phones, all the other kind of handheld video cameras, that kind of thing, they all function using these digital image sensors. And here's a disassembled digital camera to gander at. So that kind of brings us to present day, and now we don't even really think about, I can't remember, if you're particularly interested in photography, then maybe carried around, but most of us just use our phones, I think, which is also crazy. So great. So what has all this technology allowed us to do as far as creating film and video art? So the first thing I want to talk about is Georges Méliès, who was a French filmmaker and is sort of well known for really I think one of his more famous ones is Le Voyage dans la Lune, like the Voyage to the Moon. This is on the YouTube playlist. It was filmed in 1902, and he was one of the first people to really kind of dive into all the kind of effects one could achieve using film and a camera, as far as, kind of doing, double exposures or doing real hard cuts, making people disappear, reappear, showing like people, kind of really using the artfulness of, and he would kind of do it all with a single camera. So he'd set up these elaborate sort of stage sets and have all it almost like a theater production, and then capture it on film, but also kind of incorporate all these film techniques that were sort of unique to that you couldn't do in real life, right? You had to use film for in editing. So there's a couple of his films that have survived. I think most of them got burnt up in a studio fire, but as far as like the first really kind of funky thing that somebody tried to do with film, he's pretty far advanced to a lot of the other people doing funky things with film. So, and I think it's also good to mention too that at this time, these film works were either scored with music or they were silent. So you've got this kind of storytelling that doesn't really rely on spoken narrative. So please watch this. Next, we'll talk about Meyer Darren and Meshes of the Afternoon. It's a really like kind of hallmark American surrealist film that she and her husband at the time shot in and around their house. And I would say I want you all to watch it. Really early kind of 1943s. I think she's finally starting to get the credit that she's due for it. But just really amazing film. Again, using kind of film techniques and sort of weird camera angles and these types of things, while still really having sort of a real experimental narrative as far as using a visual narrative to sort of navigate through this film, and using a lot of like kind of surrealist symbolism, and it just ends up being really haunting in a lot of ways. So this is, I feel like, kind of along with Un Chien Andalou, which is another famous surrealist film by Buñuel and Dali. Really kind of 1940s kind of interesting surrealism. And I think a little later on, in the course, we'll watch René Clair's Entr'acte, which is one of my favorite kind of film pieces because it is. I love the Dada, so in comparing that to a modern day film piece with Tito Storell. But please watch Meshes of the Afternoon. It's really amazing. And I'll make sure that it's posted on the YouTube page. But again, like thinking about creating narratives through visual storytelling as opposed to, having things be overly explained. Cool. And then in 1975, the art group Ant Farm did a media burn where they took a space-age car and blasted it through a wall of TVs on video. And again, so there's this kind of, for a long time, even from the film era, but even kind of getting into after television was invented, the means of production as far as media was really kind of controlled by television stations and movie studios and those types of things. So when the technology finally became available for people to express themselves in a way that was independent from these big institutions and also all the kind of norms that they espouse as far as society goes, there was sort of this big celebratory moment that people could fight back against just having a single narrative in media. And again, like if you watch old TV shows, I mean, a lot of them are, there's not different types of people represented. There's not people of color. There's not people of different sexual and gender orientations. All that stuff gets erased and whitewashed because there was only one side of the media, right? And so there's sort of a celebration that happened of smashing this old paradigm and allowing for new forms of media to be able to travel around really quickly, which, I think we all see continue in the internet today. So let's talk about Nam June Paik. So I think we talked about it a little bit earlier on, and he's sort of credited as being the founder of video art, and he used a Sony Portapak. And he used video and video screens and video technology in a whole lot of different ways, which we'll kind of go through right now. And I think it's really a testament, like all this kind of can be considered video work, but the forms that it takes are so different and interesting that it's a really good kind of treasure trove of things to draw upon. So in one instance, so here's his Magnet TV in 1965, and he took a TV set and made it unable to receive broadcast signals. And then the old television sets used to work by electromagnetism, and so what he did was take a really powerful magnet and put it on top of the TV and sort of arrange it so that it would create this aesthetic image. But it was also this kind of image that was created, static image, right? So it didn't move, but it was a static image created through this electromagnetic manipulation of light. So in 1967, Paik recorded Pope John Paul VI's visit to New York City, and this is sort of with a Sony Portapak, and this is sort of widely talked about as one of the first pieces of video art. So Paik's piece Global Groove in 1973 was a totally like video piece, so it wasn't kind of embedded in any kind of object or anything. Sort of imagine this. It was sort of imagining the internet before the internet was around, and the idea was that there'd be like a big global phone book of different video entertainment and information that you would dial through, and you'd be able to kind of see things from all over the world and be exposed to culture all over the world from through satellite television. And it's really kind of like swinging 70s, psychedelic, a lot of video effects and interesting stuff like that. Check it out. So here's TV Buddha that he made in 1974, where the statue of the Buddha staring at a TV recorded or a live broadcast image of the statue on a television set. So here's a great kind of way that he incorporated video into an actual sculptural piece. And it's combining the icon of contemplation, who is the Buddha, with the medium of popular culture, which is the TV. And sort of examining these issues of how do we, how do we in America sort of contemplate ourselves through the media. So here's another piece that he did where it's a sculptural piece, so it's presented as monitors, video flags. So each one of these flags has video on it, and you're sort of exposed to it as sort of a sculptural object in a room. But it's also not meant in here, like the video screens are actually part of the piece. They're not just meant to kind of showcase a video that's showing on them, right? They become integrated into the work, which he kind of further did with a lot of his robots, where he created these robots out of TV sets, and he would have actually images broadcasting on them, but they also became sculptural objects in their own right. Here's one, Electronic Superhighway, where it's a combination of neon and television sets. Again, sort of bringing video, but also making part of a physical sculptural piece. Great, and so now we'll transition to Andy Warhol. So Andy Warhol was also kind of pretty open to new technology and new experimentation. And so he did, he created some really iconic film pieces, like I think there's 24 Hours of the Empire State Building and some stuff like that done on film. And then when video came out and when computers came out, he also experimented with those technologies. So one of his famous video pieces is Inner and Outer Space, which stars Eddie Sedgwick. And it was a 2-screen film, and you can see the 2 screens right here. And each screen sort of was also a recording of the video image being projected back, or being kind of shown on a screen behind her from 2 sides. So you've got this kind of like the mixing of the real image and the video image, and sort of this mirroring effect. Again, sort of looking at how these things sort of play into our perceptions of self, how these things sort of cause us to contemplate ourselves and our society differently. So the technology that Andy Warhol used to record this was a slant scan tape players. And there's none of them left in the world. So there's also interesting with some of these experimental pieces. So we've got access to it, and we can see it because he played it and shot it in 16 millimeter. But if it wasn't for that, I mean, the piece would just be totally lost. So next is Wolf of Stell's Deutscher Ausblick, so like German eye blink, or German blink. So this is one of the first pieces that actually put a TV in. So this is in '59. Put a TV into like sort of a painting or sort of an art object. So even thinking about sort of what the physical qualities of the technology are, and how do you kind of incorporate it into a real life setting. Great. So next we'll talk about Bruce Nauman, who I believe still lives in New Mexico, and his Center of the Universe is on campus. So it's a big, giant concrete sculpture, which is pretty awesome that we have that. But early on, he was kind of starting to do early video work. Sorry, I had to take a little break there. So let's go back to talking about Bruce Nauman. So Bruce Nauman has done a lot of different works in a lot of different formats, but he's also known for doing these video pieces, which tend to be about 1 hour long, because that was the length of the tape reels at the time. And he would mount a camera sort of up high in his studio, and then do different types of walks or actions repetitively. And the aesthetic, or the conceptual framework behind this was that he was like, I'm an artist, and artists make art, and artists make art in their studios, so whatever I do in my studio is art, and let's explore that. So there's a number of different pieces that are all in early video pieces of 60 minutes, where you just fill these tapes up doing these actions. And a lot of them have references with this one being a walk with contrapposto, sort of the classical body pose, and doing this walk on video with this classical pose through this narrow sort of hallway. Another one, walking in an exaggerated manner on the perimeter of a square, where he would kind of do this really kind of herky-jerky walk all along kind of the outside of the square. You can see the studio here. Here's Bruce Nauman's slow angle walk. So he'd do a number of these pieces, and you can find some of them online. I'll try to add some to the YouTube playlist, but they generally aren't on YouTube. But you can find clips and snippets, and I don't think you might necessarily have to watch the whole 60 minutes to get sort of the idea. But again, here's an example, like with his video pieces, of being, I mean, a lot of them were static shots, so they weren't edited at all. They were just recording what was happening, and that was what was presented to the viewer. So again, kind of thinking about away from a little bit more maybe like what we're doing now with cell phones, where we're capturing things live as they happen and present them, as opposed to going through this editing process. And then you would also do these video installations, or this one is Corridor. So there's a television set there are two television sets at the back of these very narrow corridors. You'd walk down, and then one was a static image of just the empty corridor, and then one was a image of you walking down the corridor from way far behind. So there was a camera kind of up and mounted and back behind you, and as you walk towards it, you'd see your body moving through this space closer towards the monitors. So again, here's a video piece again, but it's really playing with space and sort of becomes sculptural in a lot of ways. So Peter Campos was another sort of early video artist, and he was invited to use a television studio's equipment to make some. He thought they were going to be transitions, so in between like shows, like they would play these pieces that he would make as transitions, and the television station said, "No, it's too weird. We can't actually play this, but you can use our equipment." So he went in there and played around and came up with 3 transitions. So, which is on the YouTube playlist, and sort of a reflection, again, self-reflection using early video techniques. So a lot of times, like the idea of taking 2 live shots and sort of compositing them over one another and making them opaque so that you can have different effects. The image here is from the one transition where he is actually putting blue paint on his face, and he's covering his face up with blue paint, which is keyed out to reveal his own face underneath. And then there's one that he does with fire, which is really great too. But I've been watching this piece a lot and thinking about it in terms of my own video work lately, as far as how to, because it just sets apart from a lot of the video that we consume today, and it's got a really nice meditative quality about it. So he did a number of different sort of works in video. So as I mentioned earlier, Joan Jonas's Vertical Roll was a really jarring piece, and where she would film these kind of long pieces with alter egos. I can't remember what her alter ego's name was. It was like Honey something. But anyway, kind of doing this piece where, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that video sort of refreshed itself from the top down, line by line. And on the early television sets, you could adjust something called the vertical roll, which was how fast that those lines got refreshed. And sometimes you'd have to change it in order to get an image. But if you really kind of adjusted it one way or another, you get this sort of rolling bar that would happen on the screen. And so she took that and explored it using sound and image and clapping and those types of things to really make a jarring piece. And it's definitely worth a watch. And so this kind of starts getting into more abstract stuff, right? And using the technology as sort of to create abstraction and to create, kind of looking at the aesthetic possibilities of the technology, and then sort of creating pieces that sort of incorporate those and produce something new. Vito Conci was an early performance artist, New York, who also started making videos. And his video theme song is a 3-part. It used to be on YouTube, but I think they took it down, so I'll see if I can find it. If you really want to be really uncomfortable. So theme song is just a static shots of him laying on the floor and smoking in his studio or apartment or wherever. But it's him talking directly to you as a viewer about, essentially trying to like get you to fall in love with them or come home with them, or like it's like basically like a weird bar pickup, but in video format. But it's also interesting because he's like talking to you, and so it was probably one of the first videos where somebody was looking in the camera and addressing you as the viewer to do something or to feel something. Yeah, definitely check it out if you can. Next, we'll talk about one of my favorite artists, Chris Burden. So Chris Burden did a lot of weird. He was a sculptor, sort of. He did a lot of sculpture things, but he also sort of translated his sculpture. A lot of these we see performance and video translated into sculpture. He kind of took the idea of sculpture and translated it into video and live performance. So, was shoot in 1971. He actually had a friend shoot him in the arm, and that was his performance piece. And I think it was documented mainly through video and still images. And so the actual piece was the performance, but the only way you'd see it, because there's a small initial audience, was he would kind of create little write-ups and relics that he would display from these different actions or videos, and then that was what you kind of experience as the art piece. So he went on to do Through the Night Softly, which was a video of him crawling, basically crawling through broken glass in a parking lot at night. And I really love this piece. I wrote a paper about it last semester. And this was actually, so he did this piece and he had somebody film it. And then he later took it and he broadcast it on TV in California. So he bought airtime and broadcast this piece of him just sort of slowly crawling through this crushed glass in a parking lot in Los Angeles. And when asked about the piece, he said it was sort of a disruption, right? Like that he knew that there'd be people watching television sort of expecting the same old thing, a lot of those media narratives and sort of norms that we talked about before, and this would be kind of seen as sort of a disruption to that world and get people to go like, whoa, what was that all about? So some of you may know, like one of his last pieces that he did was Urban Light. He's since deceased, but this is one of the museums out in LA, and I was out there right before coronavirus hit, and I got to see it, and it was really beautiful. And these are all old street lamps that he found somebody selling in California, and he took them and refurbed them and put them all together. But a lot of people are taking selfies with his Urban Light. Great. So Dan Graham. So then there's also like this piece, Present Continuous Past, which is sort of like interacting with this time-delayed video in a room with mirrors. And I think some versions of the piece have it so you can kind of watch the room from the mirrors in the background. I think are two-way mirrors, so you can kind of like, or one-way mirrors, so you can kind of see from the backside people doing this act and then also watch the video. More of a piece of observing how we interact with media and how we can watch ourselves or watch other people sort of put on a show. Martha Rosler's Semiotics of the Kitchen, 1975. So it's a piece of her just being filmed, picking up different domestic items, and especially in the kitchen, and sort of showing them in real, like, kind of herky-jerky motions about, like, this is the knife, and it chops. So one of the, 1975, so one of a really big feminist artwork kind of talking about the kind of the unfair, I'd say unfair assignment of domestic duties to women. So a lot of these early pieces too, they tend to be just sort of real basic, kind of one shot, not a lot of editing, captures the performances, and that same goes with like Marlene and Paul Kawas's Lightning, and some of the pieces by William Wigman, who's known for his doing those pictures with the dogs with like tuxedos and stuff. So that's like kind of 70s video work in one kind of strain. Yeah, I don't know why this slide is here. Chartreuse Blues, it's like stained glass, but they're all video screens, kind of showing like, you know, showing moving images, but it looks like a stained glass window. Cool, so we'll follow the William Wegman. I don't know, it's not the most interesting stuff in my opinion, but it's something. So cool, let's talk about Steiner and Woody Valsuka. So they did more real experimental kind of stuff in the 70s. While other people were using videotape, they were doing sort of analog video synthesis and playing around with these things called RUT era scan processors that sort of made these really kind of crazy images and videos by almost being able to replicate three-dimensional images through waves in a video format or on a video screen. So I'd say check out some noise fields, but not if you have epilepsy or prone to seizures, because it's a really intense visual thing. And it's basically just video and analog sound synthesis around this orb, this kind of black orb, but really starting to look into like kind of sensory perception and how, sort of limits of and aspects of our physiology that would determine how these sounds and lights are interpreted, and sort of really kind of exploring this new technology from a real technical perspective. So here's some of the scan processor studies where it was kind of taken line by line and then replicated in sort of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional monitor. Some of these should be on the playlist too. Pipilotti Risses, I'm Not the Girl Who Misses Much, in 1986. Watch it, it's great. Again, it's Pipilotti's sort of, it comes from, the line comes from Happiness is a Warm Gun, but she took it and sort of made it this feminist film piece about, it's just where she speeds it up and slows it down, and then she's kind of frenetically dancing. So it almost becomes this St. Vitus's dance of popular culture and media and sort of this reflection of people in video. So check that out. Let's see. Let's find some, yeah. We'll talk about a couple other pieces. We can skip over some of these. So I like this one, Jennifer and Kevin McCoy's Every Shot, Every Episode. So they would take kind of these, they take like old television series or a lot of like popular media and then sort of process it differently. So they would take it and they would have like, I can't remember some of the shows that they did, but they would take it and then they'd have like a DVD of all the gunshot scenes from a television series, and then they'd have like all the stranger scenes from a television series or all the car chase scenes from a television series, and they would kind of present them along with these sort of video screens and DVD players in a suitcase that you could switch out and watch these different scenes. And so really good example of recontextualizing sort of popular media and kind of finding new things to say and exploring what it says about us as sort of and about our culture through the deconstruction of media. Taylor Wood's A Little Death is really fun. Well, we'll go to Steve McQueen Deadpan. It's basically him being deadpan and doing like recreating a bunch of Buster Keaton sketches. So like kind of reaching back to those old silent film days, but then making new art with it. Taylor Wood's A Little Death. He based a video piece off the 18th century painter Chardin, and then took it and sort of recreated in real life, and then filmed it just sort of all decomposing. So it's a really interesting take on the still life. Check that out. And so as far as like, going more into electronic art, it's Jim Campbell would take, he used to be an LED engineer, and then he started making art pieces where he would use LEDs. Like here, you can see the rows of LEDs, but they're projecting onto a wall video images that sort of become fuzzed out and sort of, it's a real exploration of how much information we still need in order to see a moving image. So he's also done it with just sort of strips facing the other way that you look at, and you can kind of see like, where it's just really like two colors. So I would say watch the Jim Campbell video. It's really interesting to kind of look at sort of the LEDs, which we think about as something that makes things crystal clear, and looking how far, I think he really looks at how far he can push that sort of notion to make them unclear while still being clear. And then we'll talk about Bill Viola, and that'll be, I think, it. So Bill Viola has done a lot of video work for a long time, and he does these sort of so here's like these really slow meditative pieces, sometimes with images projected on waterfalls, and they're really slow, they're almost like slowly moving still lives. And a lot of it is based around sort of ideas of transcendental being, sort of this really kind of playing around with self-reflection. So I'd say, and some of his work's really hard to find too, but I'll try to see if I think there should be some on the YouTube playlist. Great, so I think that's enough for now, and we'll probably talk about some of these different artists in class, but I'd say just become vaguely familiar with them, and then we'll kind of dive deeper in our weekly discussions. So thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, hit me up. Otherwise, I will see you all in class. Thanks. Bye.